Mixing and mastering are crucial, but what if I told you that your room was sabotaging your sound? In this video, I'll explain how your room is affecting what you're hearing and what this means for your productions and mixes. The aim of this video is so that you end up with a room where you can hear your music more accurately, because if you can't hear what you're doing, how can you be making great decisions? I'll talk about problems, solutions, and how to understand what's going on in your room using measurement. Thing is, you've probably not prioritized your acoustics. You've probably spent more time learning the techniques of music production and probably spent more money investing in things like new studio monitors or software, plugins, synths, all the exciting stuff, when actually they won't produce as useful an outcome as concentrating on the acoustics. So the consequences of this mistake is that you won't be able to understand what's going on in your music properly. You'll make decisions in your studio that don't translate well to other systems unless you spent a lot of time learning how your room sounds. So I would say that the thing you need to do is understand what problems you have with your room and then figure out the changes to put in place to sort them out. If you do that, you'll then be someone who really wants to make music in your studio rather than someone who gets frustrated when they're in there. The benefits are that you'll hear your music better. You'll be able to understand what the problems are with your room and how to counteract that when listening to your music. And as a result of both of these, you'll make more consistent, better sounding mixes and masters. So here are some of the biggest problems I hear about from people who work on their own music. They're usually around the bottom end. They're around how the bottom end translates to other systems. They're around how the kick and bass work off each other. They're around having rumble on sounds that they didn't know. They're around problems getting tracks louder. And it's not just the low end. People also have problems with listening to the mid-band and being able to ascertain that there's frequency overlap and knowing what to do with that. And let's face it, no one likes a muddy mix. So what are the most common problems with rooms? Well, with rooms you get reflections, standing waves and resonances. So reflections happen off every single surface, particularly hard surfaces, and it's really normal in a room, in a house, to have hard walls, hard floor, hard ceiling, maybe carpet on the floor, maybe a sofa in the back. But there's not much soft stuff going on, and that means there's not much soaking up the sound. If there are soft furnishings or soft things like carpets, they tend to be really thin, which means they don't absorb anything below the very highest frequencies. Other problems include having parallel surfaces that are quite near each other, which means you get standing waves building up between them which can accentuate particular frequencies. And again, most often this is prevalent in the low frequencies, in the bottom end, in the bass. And what this causes is that certain frequencies will stand out and others will completely disappear, and it will vary depending on where you are in the room and what frequency is being played. And then the third thing is resonances, and that's when things in the room are vibrating themselves. So you might have a radiator on the wall, or you might have a cupboard, or you might have a window or a door, and it's vibrating in sympathy with certain frequencies, just causing it to sound that bit more unclear. And it's easy to see how all these things interrelate with the problems you're having with getting your mix right. If you've got things vibrating at certain frequencies, when those frequencies are being played from your mix, you're not going to be able to hear what's coming from the speakers versus what's happening in the room. And so the decision you're making isn't necessarily based on the sound from the speakers, it's the sound from the whole system. And with high frequencies, if they're bouncing around all the time, that's going to give a false sense of reverb, but it's also going to cause smearing, which means that you won't be able to hear your panning decisions particularly well. And the general reflections that happen around the room will cause all sorts of other phase-related issues as well, which means that you'll just not hear things as well as you might. You might get some kind of comb filtering. So what are the solutions? Well, one of the first solutions is looking at how your room is laid out and oriented. So the first thing to try and do is to get your speakers equally distanced from each of the side walls. If one is closer to a wall than the other one, then it stands to reason that the reflection from that wall will occur quicker than the reflection from the other wall, which means you're going to get that speaker amplified off that wall and that one less amplified off that one. That one will sound louder, there'll be some phasing going on because of the reflections and the way it interrelates with the speaker, etc, etc. So the key takeaway here is that symmetry is a good thing. So place your speakers an equal distance from the two side walls and also from the back wall that they are in front of. And quite often it's common to put speakers on the desk, but the problem with that is that means the speakers will make the desk vibrate itself, which causes problems again, as we talked about before. You're not hearing the speakers, you're hearing the speakers and the desk vibrating in sympathy. So the best thing you can do is get some really big, heavy speaker stands. You don't have to spend a lot of money on these, because actually some of the biggest, heaviest things can be stacks of concrete blocks or a wooden box filled with sand that you've made. The very least you can do is decouple them from the desk by using some kind of isolation mounts. The next thing you can try and do is get your chair away from the centre of the room, so you don't want your chair perfectly between the two walls along the length of the room. Because if it's in the middle, there will always be a standing wave that's to do with the length of the room, and if you plonk your chair in the middle of that, then you'll be on a null or a peak, and so certain frequencies will be stupid loud and others will have completely disappeared. The rule of thumb that's usually given is to put your chair at a third of the room. The last thing to think about in terms of this is that it's better to have your speakers firing down the long length of the room, because that puts the wall behind you further away, meaning that it takes more time for that sound to reflect off the back wall and come back to your ears. The other benefit there is it means that you can have more room behind you for treatment. The next step is to implement some really easy, no calculation treatment. And this works because there's some general rules of thumb that can be easily applied. And the first thing is, wherever there's a light reflection, so if you can see your speaker in a mirror off the wall next to you there, if you can see it, then sound will bounce there. The mirror trick allows you to position some treatment either side of your speakers and above your head. Nice and easy. The second rule of thumb is, the thicker the treatment, the lower the frequencies it will absorb to a point. So don't go and buy 1 inch thick, or I should say 1 inch thin treatment, because all that will do is absorb the very highest frequencies. The other rule of thumb for quick and easy treatment is to do as much bass trapping as possible, and bass traps is a fancy word for big, deep absorbers. So in my studio, there's a whole 60 centimetres deep of treatment at the back soaking up bass, and there's more at the front as well. And the easy rule of thumb related to bass is that bass builds up in corners, so probably the best place to put some bass absorbing treatment is in the corners. And in fact, if you're a dab hand with the DIY, then you can make panel absorbers and you can make bass traps. It's probably going to be the best thing you can do for low budget. One thing I would say is don't go crazy. You can make it worse rather than better by filling the whole space with treatment. You'll see behind me wooden panels. That's because this room has got a very absorbent structure, and so the wooden panels reintroduce some reflections so that the sound isn't completely dead and nasty. If you want to get more complex, then the best thing to do is to start taking measurements. And really you need to take measurements before you implement any treatment so that you can understand the baseline, i.e. where your room is before you introduce treatment. You can do some really simple measurement stuff, which is by setting up a sweep tone on your DAW and slowly having that rise from a very low frequency like 20 Hz up to a high frequency. And you'll be surprised just how loud and quiet certain sounds sound as the frequency rises, and that will help you pinpoint where some of those problems are. Remember what I said at the start, knowing where the problems are helps you figure out solutions. And it might be that simply for you, just knowing that you've got a resonance in the room at 120 Hz means that when you're working on that area in a mix or master or a production, you can be conscious that your room has a tendency to accentuate it. The other thing you can do with running those sweeps is move around the room and listen to how the room behaves in different positions. And that can help you understand where the best place to put your chair is or your desk is. And there's a real interrelationship between the position of the speakers and the position of your chair. And so one of the things you can do is run a sweep with the speakers in one position, move the speakers, run the sweep again, and see how different it sounds. Does it sound better? I mean, really, you can do this just by playing music that you know. If you decide to, you can go down the more complicated route of using something like REW to take measurements and then overlay those measurements on top of each other on a graph so that you can see how things are changing. And when it comes to that, you can carry out micro movements, moving your speakers inches at a time or your chair inches at a time, and see the impact that that has on the sound in the room. And you might find that just by pushing your speakers 2 inches further back, you get a more balanced sound, because that's what we're after. The key thing here is to think about this as an iterative process, which means that you do a bit, check what's happened, do a bit, check what's happened, do a bit, check what's happened. So if we think about buying or making treatment, always start with the bass traps first, because you might find that by absorbing the bass, you've dealt with the other issues at the same time. What I haven't mentioned yet is room correction software such as SonarWorks or ARC, or even manual correction using EQ. And the thing is, these are all really useful tools, but they shouldn't be your first place to go. The first place to go would be to put some acoustic treatment in and look at your room orientation and all those things. Once you've done that to the best of your abilities, budget and space restrictions, then is the time to look at those software-based solutions. At the end of the day, all of these things are things that you should think about. And what really matters is that you are thinking about it, understanding how your room is influencing what you're hearing. But if you can get your room sounding that bit better so that you can become more confident with the way it sounds, which means that your mixes and your productions come out sounding more consistent, then that's got to be a good thing. So in summary, the best thing you can do is to do something. Doing nothing, you won't get any improvement. Doing something, you might get a little improvement. Click the link around this video to download my free guide on how to make DIY panel absorbers, a cost-effective way of improving your room's acoustics.